back with Paul Peterson, the designer of Smash Up. Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
I'm happy to do it.
Great. Well, we have a couple of questions for you, starting with Eric.
All right, so for some of us that don't know your personal history, how did you get started with AEG and designing board games?
Okay, well, I took a very unique tact into being a game designer. I was working for Microsoft in customer service, telling people they couldn't have Windows support, and then I found this awesome game called Magic the Gathering in the game store, and I started playing it. And very early on, Magic the Gathering had a lot of questions that players had, and so there was a place where you could go and get these questions answered. It was a mailing list. It was just sort of a reply all email, basically, is what it was. That where you could ask your questions like, how does banding actually work? Because it's very confusing. And so I would be on Magic-L asking questions, and after a while answering questions, because people would still come up with the same, somebody new would join the mailing list and come up with the exact same questions that a million people had answered. So we started making canned answers. As soon as they popped in and said, how does banding work? We'd pop up, somebody would pop it up. And after a while, the official people from Wizards of the Coast noticed that I was answering questions a lot. And they said, you know, we're kind of busy making Magic. Could you just run the mailing list? So I started doing that, getting paid in Magic cards, probably really high rate of pay if you consider that I was getting paid in very early Magic cards. But anyways, so I was doing that for a while, and eventually it came out that Wizards of the Coast was hiring customer service people. And so I was kind of their dream person in that I was a customer service person, and I knew Magic well enough to be the person that officially answered Magic questions. So I went in and interviewed and got the job there. And once I was there, I started playing games with the people there, including Richard Garfield, the designer of Magic the Gathering. And we'd play games. They were working on Robo Rally a lot. I'm a big fan of Robo Rally, as you can see. They were playing a lot of Robo Rally, and at night we would play Robo Rally, and then we'd all talk about it, you know, what was going on and what we liked and didn't like about it. And Richard and I would stay later than anybody just talking about it and figuring things out. And that went on for a little while, but so really how I became a game designer, that whole long story boils down to one day I was at my customer service job at Wizards of the Coast, and Richard came up and said, Paul, we don't want you to be a customer service person anymore. We want you to be a game designer. We want you to come work on Magic and the other projects we're working on. And so I was basically tapped on the shoulder by the creator of Magic the Gathering to be a game designer, and you don't say no when that happens. So
Nice.
What an honor.
yes, very much so. My relationship with AEG, so I was with Wizards for about 5 years, and then I went and worked on computer games for a while, and then I started a company called Hidden City Games with Peter Atkinson, who started Wizards of the Coast. He was the president and CEO of Wizards of the Coast. And Jesper Mirfors, who was the original art director. We started a new game company called Hidden City Games, and we were making a game called Clout, which is a really weird name for a game that's basically kind of Magic the Gathering on poker chips, but you throw them. And then it's about trying to get your poker chips near your opponent's poker chips to activate abilities and things like that.
That actually sounds really fun.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. We had a business model of we didn't actually sell the game. We just made it, and we had partners everywhere around the world who would sell it. And in America, that partner was AEG. The AEG and Wizards of the Coast have a very long history of partnerships on various things. And John Zinzer, worked at Wizards of the Coast for a little bit, and then went back to doing AEG. And so we became friends doing that. And he's a huge fan of Clout. Like, long after that game didn't exist anywhere else, we could go to his house and he'd open up his pool table and we'd play Clout because he loved that game so much. So we became really good friends around that time. And then when it was time for me to, after Hidden City shut down and I went back into computer games for a while, I decided to make board games again. And so after I'd made my first few board game prototypes, I went to show them to people. And one of the first people I contacted was John, because we had such a good relationship. And I said, and Smash Up was one of the prototypes for that. So that's sort of how AEG got involved and how I have a history with them and how much I consider those people my friends. So
That's such a wonderful backstory. I love that.
yes, I do have a good backstory.
Hey Paul, it's interesting how you mentioned Magic the Gathering in your early career because Smash Up is very often compared to Magic the Gathering. Were there any specific influences that stood out when you were designing Smash Up?
Oh, absolutely. When people ask me like where Smash Up came from, it came from my desire to capture something that I really loved about trading card games. So trading card games, there's two parts of a trading card game. One of them is obviously playing the trading card game, and that's a lot of fun. But it's a trading card game, so you have to have your own deck. That's the other half of playing a trading card game is actually building your own deck. And so I love that part of it too. Like those two are sort of equal in my mind. I like sitting down with the deck I've made and playing it with people, but just as much as that, I like making the deck and making a deck I think is clever and things like that. The problem with that, or the challenge of that part of the fun, is doing it when you're looking at like the thousands and thousands of Magic cards that exist. And even if you're only looking at the current Magic environment, it's still probably it's hundreds and hundreds of cards, and you've got to decide which 60 cards you're going to put together to build the deck you're going to play with, right? Excuse me. It's a daunting task, and I mean it can be a daunting task. And if you're into that, that's great, and I certainly have been into that, but I also sort of wanted to explore easier ways to do that, to capture the feeling of I made choices, and they ended up with this deck, and now I'm playing it and enjoying it because I made those choices. And so from the get-go, that was the concept of Smash Up. Was what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I really like direct damage and counter spells, or I really like big creatures and buffing them. And I want to take those, be able to easily take two concepts and put them together. And what fell out of that basically was the idea of these factions where, I really like weenies. I'm going to pick robots. I really like getting things back after they've gone out of play. So I'm going to play zombies. Now I'm just going to shuffle those together and I've got my robot zombie deck. So it's like the influence of Magic the Gathering and Vampire and all of the games I've worked on is easily seen in Smash Up.
And that's one of my favorite parts, the fact that much of the work is already done for you so that if you're a new person, I could just hand you a deck that's pre-constructed and say, here are robot zombies. You're going to have a great time with it.
Yes, absolutely. That's where the work comes in.
Yeah.
So you seem very passionate about games and gaming in general, but sometimes we know that creators need a break from their baby. Have you ever felt this way about Smash Up?
Not yet. I mean, we've got over 60 factions now. We've got, I don't remember what the numbering is. We're on expansion 11 or 12. No, maybe the current one I'm working on, which isn't out obviously, or even announced, is like 14 or something like that. So I'm not tired of it yet. I mean, it can be challenging to try to keep making something new and fresh, but I think I hope I've been succeeding. Like everybody, it's really nice when I post the new decks to the playtesters and they're like, "Wow, that's brand new. That's new that we haven't seen. You haven't done that before," or "That's very interesting that you're using the cards in that way." Like when I made Titans for Big in Japan, everybody was like, "Oh, that's a really good addition to the game." So much so that that people want Titans for the other factions now. So
awesome. Do you like to play Smash Up outside of your playtesting and development as just like a game you play for fun?
I do, not as much as honestly, not as much as I would like. I always feel a little weird when I go to play games with people and I'm like, "Hey, let's play my game." So I still enjoy it, and when people are like, "Let's play Smash Up," I'm like, "Yeah, I'm right there. Let's do this. Have fun." And but I also get a lot of fun games in with the playtesting already. So
So, being the creator, do you ever feel you have an unfair advantage when playing other people?
Sometimes, yes. Especially when I'm like, I mean, I have all of the playtesting data for the newest sets, so I'm like, oh, it works really well with this set with kaiju is dragons. Dragons works really well with kaiju. So, oh, why don't I just? In fact, I actually, when I'm just playing with people at conventions and things, I tend to avoid specifically grabbing the ones that I know are really good, and I just try to play the decks I think will be the most fun. The ones where I'm just like, I really like playing the elves from Munchkin, and I'm gonna try playing them with ignobles, and I'm just gonna give away everything I have and still try to win the game. That kind of thing.
Spoiler alert, that's actually a really powerful combination. They work so well together.
They do have some pretty good synergies, actually.
So, when you're creating a new faction, how do you keep them balanced between the old and the new?
Well, we have amazing playtesters for AEG is recruited, and certainly over 14 expansions, we've refined them. We always put out calls for new teams, but we have a lot of teams that have been doing this for a long time, and that are already familiar with, like, they have played kaiju with a whole bunch of other factions already, because they tested big in Japan, and so, or they played all of big in Japan with a whole bunch of other factions. And so when a new set comes out and they're like, oh, well, we need to test Egyptians now, they can already they have a much better feel for how it will pair with kaiju, because they've played kaiju with a whole bunch of other things, and they can see those synergies, and it's just it's really good to have experienced playtesters who have played some version of the game hundreds of times, literally. And we also have an amazing playtest coordinator who organizes all of it. Brian he's fantastic. I couldn't do what I do without him, I don't think.
What's a faction that you've wanted to do thematically but you haven't figured out mechanically?
That's an interesting question, because it sort of doesn't work that way. That's not entirely true. There was it doesn't work that way usually, because usually we come up with the factions and then we use them, and it's very rare that I am like, oh, I can't figure something out, I'm not going to do that faction. But it has happened a couple of times. Like, there was once upon a time I was trying to do a Berserker faction that was about your guys could sort of blow themselves up to get huge bonuses, but then they go away. But it's really tricky to make that work properly, because you end up just doing that on one single turn and getting rid of all of your stuff and getting an explosive outcome and then being reset to 0, and it was fun to have those explosive outcomes, but it was hard to manage getting them back and building back up again. Some of that stuff ended up turning into werewolves, basically, which don't get rid of themselves, but can activate for boosts on their turn, basically. So that's sort of the one. Well, I'm sure that there are probably other examples of things like that, but that was definitely one where I was trying to make some mechanics work and fit to a faction, and we ended up not using that faction because it wasn't coming together properly.
Very cool.
So are you planning any new game-changing mechanics similar to like how the Titans shook things up?
Well, not that often. It's nice. I mean, I always try to keep it fresh, and I always try to keep something in there that's new, something in there that is familiar, something in there that's easy for a new player. Like those are all goals every time we make one of these 4 faction sets, right? So that a new player can come in and be like, oh, I'll just put these 2 together and it'll play in a way that I can mostly understand. But for an experienced player who's like, okay, well, what's new? I'm not sure what we've announced about the voting faction. There's a new thing in there. It's not like Titans. It's not a new card type, but it's a new way to play cards that are in the next voted expansion. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what people think about that, and just try to keep something new in there, but not necessarily as big as Titans. Titans is certainly the biggest thing we've done since maybe Munchkin, obviously, or Cthulhu. Those are sort of the big spikes of like let's add new cards into the game and to do things in a different way.
I love the Madness cards. I think that's a fantastic little twist on the existing structure of the game.
Right. I keep thinking we should do another Cthulhu set. Now that Cthulhu has so much, it's been out for so long, and we know sort of how it works and where. Like it was a difficult set to test because of the Madness cards, and they're so swingy. But I think we might be able to do something cool and innovative if we ever came back around to trying to do Madness cards, and maybe have a deck of Madness cards that don't do exactly what those Madness cards do, and so you get some choices and things. But it'd be good to revisit that eventually. But yeah, I really liked how it all turned out.
Oh, that would be cool. I'd so be on board for another set of Madness cards.
Excellent. So you were talking, we were talking earlier about, the mechanics and the theme. So my question was originally, what comes first, the mechanics or the theme of a faction? But we kind of touched about that a little bit. So how do you really develop a new faction? Like, where do you get your whole idea from, and how do you develop it from beginning to end?
From beginning to end. So it depends. Usually I'm given or choose a faction specifically, like the voting ones, the public chooses, and then we're like, okay, how do we make Cowboys work? And then I try to think about, like, I mean, we go around and brainstorm, but often it ends up with me sort of being like, well, what do Cowboys do? Do I want to make the whole faction about driving cattle from one place to another? Well, we could do that. That's a thing Cowboys do. Maybe the faction could be about trying to get all your cows from one base to another and getting a bunch of victory points for doing that. That doesn't feel like what the fans are asking for when they told us they wanted to do Cowboys, but that's a way you could go. But then you think about, like, well, what else are when you think of Cowboys, what do you think? You think high noon. You think outside the saloon in the street. They're facing each other and they're both ready to draw their guns. So the mechanics for Cowboys are much more about that. So started with the faction Cowboys. What do they do, and then how can I mirror that in the game? But for Kaiju was a little bit of both. For a while now, I've wanted to explore a faction that didn't work the way other things did, that didn't have a whole bunch of minions in it, that had a whole bunch of actions. Like, because until we actually came up with the Titan cards, the Kaiju didn't exist on the game board. It was just sort of like, you were the Kaiju. You were smashing the town. You were, doing things like that. That was where I started with that. And eventually we came around to the Titans, which I think actually ended up much better for everything. But that one was a marriage of, like, I really want a faction that somehow uses its actions but can still win the bases. And the natural pairing for that is somebody who does something big like a Kaiju. So those married very early, but that sort of came from mechanics too. And sometimes, like the Innsmouth in the Cthulhu set, where it was just like, well, what happens if the faction's got 11 of the same guy, and that's what the faction's all about, is the townsfolk there and getting them and getting a bunch of them out and winning and then getting them all back. And so that was sort of mechanical, but it was nice that it fit into the Cthulhu theme too. So
we've mentioned this on the show before, but I think that you guys do such a phenomenal job of creating a theme that so permeates the mechanics, because if you know anything about Innsmouth and the people from Innsmouth, you absolutely capture this beautiful synergy between the literature-based, ideology behind the Cthulhu set with what it actually does in the game, and I think that's just phenomenal.
Well, we're all geeks. We have deep knowledge of a lot of these, and like in Cease and Desist, going for the Astronites, we knew a lot of exactly what we wanted and a lot of the flavors that we wanted those things to have from our fandoms for those events. And even early on when we were doing the Time Travelers, and we wanted to capture some of the Doctor Who, Dr. Wen thing, but also just sort of like Back to the Future and all of the time travel tropes and movies and things. We're deeply invested in that, and a lot of times, like my first pass on a faction will be like all in on the mechanic, like the all the like there's no minions in the kaiju faction, it's all actions, and pretty soon we come back around and it's like, well, yeah, but there are some interesting people in that mythos too. It's not just the kaiju destroying everything. It's like the two tiny ladies who summon Mothra. Those are awesome. We need to capture that feel, or the little boy from the Gajira story, not the Gajira stories, the Gamera stories, who's a friend of Gamera, and Gamera comes and saves him. We want to capture a lot of the different tropes around that whole area, and a lot of times too, like we'll be deep in and we'll be like, oh my goodness, we don't have that little boy in there. What should we do? I think that's important, and we'll throw out a card and put in a card, or we'll change a mechanic to be like, well, the little boy, that's not how the little boy works. The little boy just appears and the monster comes and gets summoned, and so we'll change the mechanics around that too. We're deeply invested in making sure that when you play these factions, that you recognize the things that we're trying to make you recognize, and that it feels right to you, so that a fan who's like, you know what, I really love Power Rangers, and I really love Voltron, and look, this Japan set has a faction in it that's kind of those guys, these Blitz Troopers. They kind of look like that's what you're trying to capture. And so you want that fan to pick up that deck and mix it with another deck, but when they're playing, they're like, this feels right. This feels like you're answering my fandom with this faction. So
I was going to say that half the fun is when a new faction is announced, because it mirrors so closely, you can kind of figure out what it's going to do, and you're so excited when you're right. But it's also really great when you're wrong, and it's like, wow, I never thought about that, but that totally makes sense.
Right. I like that too. Like if I put out the Cowboys, I did mess around with the mechanics of like, well, what, like for part of it, there was definitely still going to be dueling in there. There's still going to be gunfights in there. But for part of it, I did have a mechanic in there where you were like trying, for a while, there were a bunch of cow minions and you were trying to get them from one place to another place, and you get victory points for doing that. It just, I think if I had made it work, it would have been funny, and the fans still would have enjoyed it. But in the end, we were just like, well, that's not working out very well, and people will be just as happy if there's a lot of gunfights going on. So,
okay, so yeah, this dovetails really nicely into one of my questions, which was occasionally in Smash Up we see characters that are very familiar to us. Obviously, it's a nod to some form of pop culture. So how do you balance the creative properties within Smash Up with potential copyright issues?
We're really careful about that. It's all in fun. It's all in good fun, and we're, in some sense it's very clearly a parody of that. Even so, it's like, and in many cases, I've spoken to creators of the things we're being funny about, and they're usually exactly on board. And we're not trying to infringe on their rights in any way. We're trying to give a nod, like you said. We're trying to give a nod to the fans and say, this is, you will recognize this. Wink, wink. Isn't it funny? And we'll put a funny picture on it, and we hope you enjoy it because of that. So,
in a game with this much card text, you're going to have tricky situations. They're inevitable. How often are you asked for official decisions or clarifications?
All the time, sort of. But we, like I said, we have really good play testers, and we have a couple of people who are like understand the rules better than me, which is, understand the nuances and remember the rulings we've made before. Like, there was just a question, just the other day, somebody asked a question about about how one of the Titans works or something like that, that just sort of hadn't come up. And we had to sort of say, well, we've ruled similar things in the past like this. So I think this is how it should work. And that's always going to come up when you have as many different cards interacting in as many different ways. We are a simpler game than Magic the Gathering, but we are creeping up on the number of cards, and every card being able to interact with every other card in the game, you're going to come up with times when they're trying to do the same thing at the same time, or you're not actually sure which one of them should have priority when they're trying to do two different things. And we've done as well as we can to clean that up, but those questions still come up all the time. And we catch most of them in playtesting, I'd say, definitely. Especially because, like, I write up all the cards and we send it out and everybody's like, you meant ongoing here, right? Not talent. And I'm like, oh, no, yes, you're right. I was thinking about it like this, or I changed the ability and it didn't, that happens in playtesting constantly. But at the end of the day, they're testing it so much that they will play those combinations and figure out some of the rules problems that happen. And also, since we're trying to make something new and clever every time, and we're adding in kaiju and we're adding in titans, like adding titans to the game when there haven't been titans before means now you really have to consider a card from 5 sets ago that said destroy a card on a base instead of destroy an action on a base. And at the time that was totally fine, but now you're like, well, that card destroys titans now. Is that okay? And you either have to go back and errata it, or you have to, figure out if that's okay. And you have to find that and think about it while you're making the set and decide, well, I guess that's how Titans work, and I guess that's how this card works now. So adding new complicated stuff all the time that you didn't think of when you made cards 5 sets ago will also come to bite you and create questions about, like, well, how does this interact with that thing that we did before?
One of the ways that Magic the Gathering kind of mitigates that issue is by having the different formats and having, things rotate in and out of play. Do you see any kind of future like that for Smash Up?
I'm not going to say never, but in general, the answer, when we've talked about things like that internally, like doing a second edition and cleaning up a bunch of stuff, like it would be nice if a couple of the zombie cards got changed, maybe, so that they weren't quite as good with everything. They wouldn't mix quite so well with everything, right? Or you look at the factions that everybody's playing and that win the most, basically, because we have lots of data about which ones win the most. And there's a temptation there to be like, well, we'll put out a second edition and we'll fix that. But at the same time, this isn't that game. This isn't Magic the Gathering. I mean, I'm glad that we have parallels, and I'm glad that we have fans that enjoy both games. But we make, like, the difference in a game between you drawing your 5-powered guy and not drawing your 5-powered guy, or drawing your weakest actions versus your strongest actions, can be fairly significant. And in Magic, they are very much trying to balance every card against every other card. We aren't doing that. We're trying to balance every faction as best as we can against every other faction, so that when you mix the two of them together, you have an enjoyable game. But we have a lot of variance within any particular faction, and if you just draw the right cards, we have a much higher variance there than Magic does. So we tend to say that why would we cut down on that and just, if something's a problem, if you're having a problem in your games and you're just like, oh man, my friend just wins with zombie robots all the time, then be like, dude, stop playing zombie robots. Like, let's have some fun. Or you'll be like, okay, well, let's draft the factions, and you'll be like, I'll take the zombies. Now, what would you like to start with?
Good, I like that answer. So
how's creating the fan suggested factions versus creating them from scratch from your own?
That's it can be a little more challenging, because I don't have, like, when we designed Big in Japan, we started with the idea of what factions and mechanics are of interest to us. We made a big list of Japanese fandoms and Japanese things that we liked, and we were like, wow, what if we did this, or anime? Well, what anime do we like? We could do more fantasy dungeony kind of anime. That would be great. But or magical girls, because people like magical girls. But anyways, we had a lot more freedom we made a big list of factions for Japan, or for any of the ones that we create. and then we kind of mull over that, and we're like, well, does anybody have any ideas, especially me? Do I have any ideas for, you know what? It would be awesome if we captured the feel of kaiju by doing this, or it would be awesome if, you know, or for Pretty, it's like, well, what do cats like? You know, I have a lot more freedom because I have a huge list that I can then look at and figure out whether I have mechanic ideas that match those things, and then we can sort of pull down and make sure that we still have ones that we think that the fans are going to like, factions we think the fans are going to like as much, but also ones that I have ideas for. So I have more freedom there, basically. I have more choices. When on the fan voted ones, it's like, nope, here are your 4 things. You are going to make some Cowboys. How are they going to react? You know, but that also in some sense is, that is also in some sense very satisfying, because when in the first fan voted factions, like, who knew that sharks were gonna win? Like, I mean, they're awesome, but who knew that the fans were gonna vote and say, sharks, you need to make a faction full of sharks. What? Go. That's an awesome challenge to be presented with, to be like, okay, make a smash up faction that's about sharks, and you know, and so I put my cap on. It was like, well, you know, we're going to make a destruction faction. We have a few of those. This one's going to be the same. But how are sharks different? But it's a really fun, and it stretches my brain basically to try to match something that somebody else put in front of me that isn't what I was expecting, as opposed to trying to figure out what is interesting and fitting it into a much bigger list.
So 13 expansions in, it seems like anytime a new expansion comes out, for a lot of fans, it's an automatic buy. Doesn't matter what's in there, they know that they're going to want it because they can't get enough of this game. What's it like to create a game that has such a passionate fan base?
That is a really good question. I love my fans. I'm so honored, basically, that people like what I created enough. And it's not just me either, by the way. I like, AEG is an amazing company, and this is really peanut butter and chocolate. Like, my game idea with their vision for what the game could be. My original prototype, I mean, I knew that I could make a bunch of factions for this, that was the type of game it was. It was designed to make a bunch of factions, but just from the get-go, they were just all in, and we're going to do 8 from the get-go, and we're not just going to release 4 and see how it goes. We had designed the first couple expansions before the base game hit the market, like, and the artwork is better than I could have imagined it being. The fact that they choose different artists, I mean, we have repeats nowadays because we have so many factions, but like in the beginning, like no artists, very very rarely did artists do more than one faction, and they all gave it their own feel, and they made everybody fall in love with different factions and individual factions, and but all of it came together to make a product that really, I think, speaks to gamers, and I'm just so absolutely pleased. Every time we get to make a new expansion, I'm just tickled. I'm just like, I'm so glad that people continue, like, after 13 expansions. There are not a lot of games that get 13 expansions, and with still the amount of love that we get every single time. So I that's one of the reasons I work my hardest to make sure that there's something new for everybody, so that it's not, oh, the new Smash Up faction came out and it's basically the same 4 factions that have been seen before, but now there's pictures of dogs on them, and I wouldn't want to do that. I would never want to do that. I always want it to be a good joke and a good mechanic and something new in there that makes people go, Titans, what are those? So.
Which one is your favorite faction to play?
This is a horrible question. Which of my babies do I like the most? No, it honestly changes. Like, when a new set comes out, I fall in love with one of the factions in there, and I start playing it with other factions. Like, one of my favorite combinations is plants and ants. I love plants and ants. It's a lot of fun because the plants get to cheat a little bit because they like the sprouts can go search for an ant that's actually really huge, but it's okay because his printed value is only 1 because he gets a bunch of counters, and it just tickles me every time I like turn my sprout into some big ant that they weren't expecting, or I still love shapeshifters to this day. I adore kaiju because they play so differently than everything else. So yeah, I am always, and it does change dramatically based on like what I've played recently, and like I said, when I go play at the conventions with people, I don't grab the newest. I don't grab the best combo from the newest set. I'm like, well, let's play, and I almost pick randomly. I'm like, what speaks to me right now? I'll pick steampunk and hobbits and halflings. Let's see what that does. And I find very cool combos doing that I would never have played before, because that certainly never came up in playtesting. Should you play steampunk and halflings? But then you realize that there's a couple cards here and there that have really good synergies between those, and you have a lot of fun doing it. So
neat. Which one was your favorite to create?
My favorite to create might have been, well, I mean, I have a deep love for whatever the newest thing is because I've been so invested in it for a long time. It's like it's your new fresh love. It's your passionate love as opposed to your old comfortable love. But just sort of looking back, just sort of looking back on them, like I loved making Pretty. I really did. There were several AEG employees and me who were very vocal about like, we should do this set. This set is we should absolutely do Pretty. And it should be 100% designed on the surface to appeal to a less hardcore demographic who likes ponies and likes kittens and likes fairies. But it has to come out of the gate hitting just as hard as any other faction. This is not the faction that you hand to somebody who likes fairies and kittens, and then you just steamroller them with Cthulhu. That's no good. The design goal here is that those things come out of the gate just as hard as anybody, and they do. Like, you know, like I love playing cats against people when they're just not expecting it, and all of a sudden they're like, "What do you mean you get my minion now?" Or, "Well, you took that wait, you took it and then you sacrificed it, and now you get a whole bunch of stuff for it? What? Who lets you do that?" Right? And fairies, the first time people play fairies and they're like, "Wow, I have so many options. I can do this or this at any particular time." So that was definitely one of my favorites to make, just because we had sort of been gently fighting for a long time to it wasn't that anybody was like dead set against it, but there was just always something else that was a priority. And when we finally were like, okay, we're doing this now, it was very exciting and a lot of fun.
Well, it turned out pretty well. So
yes.
I have one final follow-up question. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. How was creating Titans for the older factions? What was your process for that? And how did you pick the factions, and how did you determine what the Titans' ability should be?
That's an excellent question. What we did was we looked back. This is one of those things I was talking about earlier, where we're like, well, what would it look like if we did a second edition? What cards would we take out? What cards would we fix for, you know? Would we make Tenacious Z only 1 power so that it's not as brutal bringing 2 power things back constantly? You know, we asked those questions, but then so with the Titans, with the doing the Titan event kit, the thought process was very much like which factions. Part of the process was which factions could use the help, because I mean, all of those factions were created, were balanced against everything, were play tested really hard. And in some sense, they are already as good as another faction, right? And so just you can't. If I just said we made a zombie Titan, and zombies get all of the stuff they already had, but now they also get a Titan on top of it. That would be a little scary in some sense, I think. That would be a little bit like, why did you give them a boost? Why did you give them, even if you design the Titan in such a way that it doesn't strictly just make things better for them, like in some sense you're giving them a boost. So one of the first things we examined was what factions have people said, what factions are people not playing as much? With an eye towards, is it because would a Titan help that people play a faction more than they're currently playing it? For factions that aren't getting played that much, would it help the perception of a faction that people are, think is weak? So we were looking at helping to balance out factions that weren't getting a lot of love, or that were perceived as being maybe weaker than other factions. So that was sort of a first hurdle. And then and then we made some others that we thought were really cool and that we wanted to do this as a Titan. And then we made sure that it wasn't that doing that wasn't going to unbalance that faction either. So a lot of them came out that way too. And then as far as creating it, when I'd made the original Titans, they'd sort of, they have to have a way to come into play, and that has to especially making ones for old factions, that can't be dependent on those old factions having a card that says bring a Titan into play, because that's not going to exist. That doesn't exist. We're not going to print a card to slide into your deck that's going to tell you to get the Titan. So we had to come up with interesting ways to get them all into play that were basically doing what the faction is supposed to do. So like for which one was it? I think the Magical Girl Titan, the Walking Castle, was about like bringing a bunch of things together, which is what they're supposed to do. And so the making Titans for old factions was very much the same thing. It's about like activating the werewolves, having the highest power places to get a Titan out for them. And we made way more Titans than we were actually going to ship out, and then we pared it down to the ones we thought were working the best and the ones that were in the faction that were doing what they were supposed to do for their factions. But so the first thing was coming up with an appropriate way to bring it into play that utilized the mechanics of the faction to bring their Titan into play. And then we were trying to make sure that they had sort of an ongoing ability and a talent ability. It's not the case for all of them, but something that they just did because they existed, because that's kind of cool, and that they are helping. One of the things for the ones that needed a little bit of help is we tried to identify what was the problem with the faction. What weren't they doing well enough? Was it that they weren't they weren't getting enough power? Did they just need a power, like strictly higher numbers places? Well, then we might give their Titan something that does that. Is it that they're doing really good, but man, they run out of cards out of their hand. They play them all and then they don't have any. Well, maybe the Titan will help them refill their hand, that kind of thing. Or like for we didn't make one for halflings, but halflings sometimes have a problem with they play their minions so fast that then they just don't have any minions in their hand. And if you then draw 2 more actions, you're just kind of looking at your hand with nothing to do with it. So if we were designing a Titan for the halflings, some giant halfling, I guess, we would probably do something that helped them get minions into their hand. Like you'll see that in the Titans throughout, that they tend to fill in the places where the faction needs help. So
that was actually my reaction when I saw the Titans, and I said, this is exactly what the faction needs with this Titan, and it just made me so excited for the kit. Actually changed my opinion on Titans. I'm going on the record saying I didn't like it because I didn't see how it worked with the rest of the game. Now that we have Titans for a lot more, I was completely on board, and I cannot be more excited for June when that releases.
Oh, that's awesome.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, for taking the time. We learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers are going to love everything that you said. We can't wait for the next expansion to come out, which is Oops, We Did It Again, coming out in September this year. And good luck with the rest of Smash Up.
Oh, thank you very much. I'd be happy to come back on sometime. I certainly don't mind chatting about Smash Up.